join me in welcoming John and our final group of panelists to the stage. Come on up.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Katie, for those kind words. I'm so excited that funding came up at every panel because we're going to talk all about funding for an hour and 15 minutes. My name is John Sirico. I am a former North Brooklyn resident. Shout out to North 6th and Driggs. But now I live in Western Queens, which you can see right from this window here. I spend the majority of my time, especially with the policy research I do, thinking about revenue streams for parks and open spaces at the Center for Urban Future, where I work. So I'm so excited for this conversation today. We're going to talk really about how we create, systemic, sustainable funding mechanisms as the city continues to grow and our parks continue to see so much usage, and ways that we can break out of this budget dance that happens every year for parks, where they might get money, they might not get money, and we think of ways that we can sustainably grow the park system. I'm joined here by some fantastic panelists, so I'm going to sit down, we're going to start the conversation, and yeah, thanks for being here. So before we get going, I'd love just an introduction from everyone and the amazing work that you all do. Just to tell us a bit about your organization and how you kind of touch the public realm. Andrea, we could start with you.
Hi. Hi, everyone. Great to see you all today. I'm Andrea Parker. I'm the Executive Director of Gowanus Canal Conservancy. We are a education, stewardship, and advocacy organization focused on the lowland area around the Gowanus Canal, which is one of the most polluted water bodies in America. That probably Newtown Creek slightly beats us out. We also have a horrible combined sewage overflow issue in the canal, which fortunately much of is being addressed under the Superfund cleanup. We're going through a massive amount of change in the neighborhood from a rezoning that just passed in 2021. And I really thank, I guess, the EPA for declaring the Superfund, because it allowed us 10 years to see how the Williamsburg Greenpoint zoning went and learn from it. I think we worked very closely with our agencies, our council member at the time, Brad Lander, and community organizations throughout the neighborhood to really develop some answers to some of the issues that came up in North Brooklyn. Certainly we have not figured everything out, but I'm excited to talk a bit more about some of those things that we've learned.
Thanks, Andrea. I'm happy because we can talk so much about those lessons learned. Mike, go ahead.
Hello. Can you folks hear me? Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Lamparello. I'm the director of Domino Park for Two Trees Management. I joined the team at Two Trees in January of 2018, about 6 months before Domino Park opened to the public. I have the incredible opportunity and responsibility and challenge of operating Domino, the park and public space, which welcomes over 1 million folks per year. I also have, I'm fortunate to be part of a team that has an ownership group that really values public space and civic projects. We spent $50 million to build Domino Park in advance of any of our waterfront buildings, and have committed to privately maintaining it at the highest standard for the public.
Thanks, Mike. And I was telling Mike I was at Domino on Saturday, and I think half of North Brooklyn was in Domino Park on Saturday. It was so nice to see. Rebecca, go ahead.
Hey, how are you? Is this on? Yep. I'm Rebecca Macklis, the Director of Urban Design and Policy at the Municipal Arts Society. A lot of folks think municipal arts focuses purely on public art. We were founded in 1893 with the 19th century definition of urban design. So employing the municipal arts, which are architecture, landscape architecture, planning, and public art, to create a livable city for all New Yorkers. So our work is really in civic advocacy for urban design. So we partner a lot with the city, working on the current Charter Revision Commission recommendations or City of Yes. And then I know John through the Alliance for Public Space Leadership, which MAS co-founded and are part of on the steering committee of. So we work with coalitions and organizations across the city to understand how we can better deliver, maintain, and activate our public realm to service people across the city. So,
thanks so much, Rebecca. So I'm going to do a little bit of a scene-setting question just to kind of get this conversation going. So as Rebecca mentioned, last year the city passed City of Yes, the biggest zoning change in a generation in 60 years. And we kind of know that we're facing this future where there's just going to be a lot more housing in New York City. And kind of to complement that, there's all these community rezonings that are happening around the city. I live right next to Long Island City. The One LIC plan is part of that effort. Knowing that, though, as these rezonings are underway, knowing that this housing's coming, we have nothing in place right now on the books to harness any of that growth for parks and open spaces. Quite literally, there's nothing in the books at all. A systemic way to capture growth for parks and open spaces. And I think what always kind of struck me is that New York City is actually quite behind there. Other cities are figuring this out and thinking of ways to tap growth and tap developers to kind of contribute to the public realm. So even as we kind of go through that experience and thinking about just ways we can almost break out of this, again, the budget dance I mentioned, where we don't have the sustainable revenue stream for parks and open spaces. We're looking at a future where there might be less federal funding. Financial outlook of the city is a bit unclear based on these next couple of months, where we're going to have to think about other revenue streams. The 2005 rezoning here that brought so much sweeping change to North Brooklyn's built environment didn't have a sustainable funding mechanism for its open space. And I would love to just kind of start the conversation here about what was the consequences of that? How do we see that today, that lack of a funding mechanism? What were the consequences? That's a question open for everyone.
I'll start. So Domino Park was, and the Domino development was not part of the 2005 rezoning, but happened shortly after in the 2012, 2014 range. And I think Domino is an interesting sort of counterpoint to the 2005 rezoning, because we had the opportunity to see the changes happening along the waterfront from the 2005 rezoning, how the other waterfront public access areas to the north and south of us were developed, how the property owners who developed those waterfront public access areas either turned the property over to the Parks Department to operate or chose to operate it themselves. And that informed a lot of the decisions that Two Trees had going into our rezoning at Domino and the focus that we wanted to make on the public space, and ultimately the best possible outcome for the public in creating that public space.
Go ahead.
And I mean, I would say that I think piggybacking on then what you did with Domino, I think down in Gowanus, we really understood that the waterfront access plan that was created here was not necessarily did not necessarily have the connective tissue that was needed in order to really provide for a longer-term funding mechanism. And that was one reason why we worked very, very closely with the Department of City Planning to develop a waterfront access plan that really makes sure that the waterfront feels public across property lines. We also, in Gowanus, I think the big move that we're making right now is forming a business improvement district that will essentially each private property owner is required to maintain their own private waterfront. We've seen here that is not necessarily done successfully across the board. So we're forming a bid that will take on that management responsibility and really spread it across the entire public space, so that in Gowanus, what we're going to have is 20 acres of new public space, that all of that will be maintained and managed in a way that really is comprehensive and feels public.
So I want to talk a little bit about rezonings themselves as a process, and I think I'd love to hear a little bit more about the bid model later too. What's interesting about New York is that we actually have all these different funding models in New York City. We just don't have the kind of citywide scale. And as a result, we have these amazing parks in New York City, but we don't have this kind of larger vision, which is, I think, the kind of conversation we're going to have today. What's scalable, what's not? Rebecca, question for you. Rezonings being complicated, years-long processes with pretty much every public and private stakeholder you can imagine involved. Can you give us a sense of where public realm funding mechanisms even factor into those conversations, if they do? And also, I know you have experience on the city's Public Design Commission. What are the sort of lessons learned when it comes to maintaining high-quality open space in the wake of these rezonings?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have the answer, but I have some things I can opine on. Yes, rezonings have a lot of stakeholders, and I think one thing is there's not a one-size-fits-all, and there's a need to build in redundancy, and thinking about how to deliver public space is only part of the solution, right? We need to be thinking about how to maintain and enable access and activation. You mentioned at Public Design Commission, where I was before MAS, we were the regulatory review agency on city-owned property. So we didn't see designs on property that was going to be disposed to private developers, but we did review public-private partnerships and publicly developed land. And to Andrea's point, someone walking down the street doesn't really care where the property line ends, but because of maintenance capacity, that really dictated how New York City Parks Department could imagine designing a park versus how something could be designed if it had that redundancy or support infrastructure backed up, like a public-private partnership or like a bid. And so for places that don't have capacity to develop a bid or can employ a public-private partnership, how can we think of ways that the city can incentivize or build in redundancy to allow parks to tap into some of that innovation and open space design more equitably? I mean, to your point of City of Yes, we have mechanisms to incentivize affordable housing. Whether developers tap into that, yes or no, and I don't know the answer, but I think there's space to do that for public space and public realm.
Speaking of public-private partnerships, Mike, Domino Park, kind of like the epitome to me of like a strong public-private partnership, and also to your point, a kind of mirror image to what went wrong in the rezoning here 20 years ago. Inviting, well-maintained, robust programming, continuing to be robustly programmed, so nice to see. But not only that, you also have a great concessions model. You have Taco Cena, you've got an ice skating rink, and I know there's more on the horizon there. Revenue that, as a private parks operator, you're able to hold on to. Which if folks don't know, that it isn't the case for most city parks. The revenue doesn't go back to parks, it goes back to the city's general fund. Can you tell us a bit about what those opportunities with concessions, with the kind of model that you have, has afforded the park in terms of amenities and maintenance? And then also what can developers learn from that process?
Well, I think even to step back for a second, this is a very vocal community that has strong opinions on their waterfront and the size of the buildings and how big the parks and open spaces are. And those are all very good things and a good counterpoint to a real estate developer who's trying to develop on the waterfront. So even dating back to 2014 when the Domino Plan was sort of introduced, there was a bit of skepticism about what Two Trees was trying to do on the waterfront, build this big, crazy park, and you're going to pay for it? Like, what does that mean? And it's going to be public? And what does that mean as a public space? Now, 11 years after the rezoning passed in 2014 and 7 or 8 years after the park's open, I'm fortunate that I get to stand up here and say that the public-private partnership worked. And we are committed to creating a space that is for the public and not just for the tenants in our buildings or our sort of hyper-local community. So there's a bit of trust between the community and us as the developers. We spend well in excess of the revenue that we generate from Taco Cena. And it's also a benefit that our long-term interests are really aligned with the community's long-term interests. We're going to own the Domino property in perpetuity, probably. And so as a result, we're willing to make decisions that don't make much sense in the short-term financial sense, but make a lot more sense in the long-term sense. And our interests then are aligned with the community's interests. So we were able to build Domino Park in the way that we did. We operate it to the highest standard that we could possibly operate it. And the Taco Cena revenue is never going to sort of come close to covering those costs, but it does help out. Or even something like the ice rink that we introduced this year. And Katie and the North Brooklyn Parks Alliance is also familiar with operating ice rinks at McCarran Park. It's a challenging sort of operational model in the short term, but we think in the long term it could be financially successful. But the other thing is it brought 35,000 people to the waterfront in the wintertime that wouldn't have otherwise come. And Taco Cena also sort of serves as these eyes on the street and activates the park in a time that maybe it wouldn't be as active. So there's a lot of different ways that you could look at the success of these concessions and the value that it brings to the park.
Can I?
Go ahead, Rebecca, please.
I'm stealing your moderator moment. I just wanted to build on what you were saying to sort of further answer your initial question to me is, I think there's also opportunity for the city to learn from what you just explained and further leverage these opportunities for city-owned property. To your point of, concessionaires going to the general operating fund, I know Center for Urban Future had a recommendation, why isn't the city, value capturing concessions to go back into public realm maintenance and delivery, and why can't we have fees on these places that lease our public land, like Yankee Stadium, and ticket fees and these types of surcharges to kind of be feeding in and allowing the city to have the resources, not as much as Domino, but start to try to allow public spaces to be maintained even if there's not a public-private partnership. Other places charge for trash or have residential parking fees, and those go into a public realm fund. I mean, we go down a laundry list, but I think there's ways to sort of be inspired by the public-private partnership at Domino and have the city figure out more ways to generate revenue to support these spaces.
Yeah, those are great points. Mike, I know we were also talking about a wastewater treatment plant that you put in at Domino, which is really looking to the future in terms of you're going to be here for a while. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so if folks have been to Domino recently, last September we opened Domino Square. It's sort of a hardscape plaza, amphitheater, concert venue, movie night homes, school graduations, all that kind of thing. There's actually a full basement underneath Domino Square, and we're in the process of building a wastewater treatment plant where we'll treat all the black water across all 5 buildings that we own at Domino. Treat the water to a quality in which it could be reused for non-potable uses, flushing toilets, irrigation. Our understanding could even be used for laundry if we wanted to. But so we'll ultimately reuse that gray water on site across all 5 buildings and Domino Park. And then ultimately we'll also be limiting the amount of combined sewer overflow because we'll be capturing all that water in a sort of rain event instead of going into the water, but into the river. But that's also an instance where most developers who have a short time horizon to get their return on investment wouldn't make the investment of building a wastewater treatment plant. It's something that some would say that city government should be responsible for. But ultimately, by us doing it, it's sort of the triple bottom line. It's the sustainable thing to do, it's a good financial model, and it's good for people.
Yeah, and I think to the point of a good public-private partnership should be taking the weight off the city a little bit, if you can, for them to fund things elsewhere. And I think a lot of what we'll talk about today is these funding models should be taking weight off the city to be able to fund parks and open spaces elsewhere. Okay, bringing it a little bit to Gowanus, Andrea. As you mentioned, Gowanus is often looked to from North Brooklyn as another Superfund site along a waterfront with massive development planned, massive development already underway in many ways. What was the funding mechanism conversation during the community rezoning process? And then I'd love to hear a little bit more about the bid proposal that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, so I mean, I would say number one, the advocacy that we worked on started from we need more open space. And not only do we need more open space on privately owned property, but we also need more street trees throughout the neighborhood, and we need more publicly owned public space. And there's a lot of opportunities for that. However, we know that the city does not have enough money to actually maintain the public space that we have. And they certainly don't have any money to maintain street trees. So I think that the conversation was really that we are talking about a green and sustainable neighborhood, but it shouldn't just be confined to this new development parcels. It needs to be really stretched throughout the neighborhood, and what are the options for finding a way to fund that? So, we looked at Brooklyn Bridge Park. Obviously, that's one property owner. We looked at, I would say we looked at essentially every park in the city, and really bids are the only mechanism that we have here where we can bundle together funding in perpetuity to care for the public realm. I would say that at the same time as we were talking about the bid formation, we were also talking about local governance and how do we make sure, I think a huge thing that we learned from this rezoning was Bushwick Inlet Park is still not built, right? And we needed to make sure that every city commitment we got actually had some teeth behind it, had a schedule and money. So we were part of a organizing coalition called the Gowanus Neighborhood Coalition for Justice. And I would say maybe 8 years ago, we were talking about an eco-district model that would sort of do both governance and funding. There's a lot of cities where eco-districts are happening very successfully. New York City, of course, things don't happen in the same way, so we had to split it up. But essentially, the bid is the sustainable funding mechanism, and then we have a sustainable governance mechanism in the Gowanus Oversight Task Force. So this was a really key thing that we won through the rezoning to get every single one of our 56 commitments very, very well detailed with clear funding and timelines, and then have an oversight structure that can keep tabs on the agencies. They have to report to us quarterly, and I'm just looking at Emily, who's nodding because she comes every quarter to report on exactly where we are with those commitments. I do think that kind of, like we talk about public-private partnership a lot with, like, this is really like community-city partnership, and like how do we actually have civic engagement that helps the city help us? And I think we need to look more towards that, especially as we're looking towards shrinking federal budgets, concern about funding in the city in general.
Yeah. This is something that I feel like, to a couple points that were made, this idea that like these funding mechanisms don't work everywhere, right? Rezonings is a great point. They're not one size fits all. Gowanus is a great example. It is a little bit different than North Brooklyn in very specific ways. And like that's okay that these don't have to work everywhere, and nor should they. I don't think you should need development to improve a park, personally. And I think we've kind of got tripped into that you need this to happen for a park to be improved. And I think a lot of the conversation around, we've created this, funding landscape that I think provides such high quality open spaces because we have all these different funding models, but as a result, we have these kind of inequities for parks elsewhere. I'm doing a lot of work right now in Flushing Meadows, Corona Park, which will never be able to have the Central Park Conservancy model just by where it is in Flushing and Corona. And now we have to figure out new ways to fund this park that has every challenge in the book, truly. But that's okay. And I think what I'd love to hear from you all, this role that you think city government could play in ensuring equitable stewardship models and funding, particularly in neighborhoods that are seeing development happening, seeing rezoning happen. How can we ensure that there's equitable stewardship throughout that area?
I think we need comprehensive planning, and in lieu of a comprehensive planning mandate, we need a comprehensive public realm plan. I think to your point, having that, I think it's wild that we don't have that, and I think starting to think about how we could get there will not only solve for how we design and mitigate inequities, but also giving a roadmap for how we get there, understanding neighborhood disparities, understanding where there's bid capacity and public-private partnership capacity where there's not, understanding what neighborhoods are prone to what, risk and what needs. So that's my spiel on comp planning would solve a lot of this. And comp planning that's not just a plan, but backed up with both staff support and funding support to implement. As Andrea was saying, we can't just plan, we need to understand how that plan gets put into action. And I also think communication is a really big part of it, how we're talking about public realm and public space needs to change. You mentioned City of Yes for housing. It is omnipresent that we're in a housing crisis and everyone understands the need of housing as infrastructure, and we need to be better at messaging public realm and public space as infrastructure for the people who are living in these homes too.
Anyone else want to chime in there in terms of what role the city government could play in equitable stewardship models?
I feel like you have a really great report on that.
I know. I spent a lot of time. Yeah. Well, okay, let me put this in a different way. If you were to design a rezoning today, you had all the control. What policy tools or financial strategies would you embed up front in that rezoning to ensure that community thrives and has the funding to do so?
But I think that totally depends on what neighborhood you're looking at. In a neighborhood like this or a neighborhood like Gowanus, you get the developers to invest in the neighborhood long term because they are actually getting value from their developments. But in so many of the places where rezonings are happening, that value isn't being created. So the city needs to provide more agency funding. There needs to be more expense funding.
Yeah.
And I don't know how you go about doing that.
And not only expense funding, I mean, maybe a portion of capital funds become, maintenance becomes capitally eligible in some way, and then you can unlock a different revenue stream.
Yeah, I see Mary in the front row here. She has an incredibly difficult job, and she just takes a lot of crap at different community board meetings for our parks not looking good when she's not really given the tools to successfully carry out her role.
And I think it would be difficult too, because you can make these promises in rezoning, but of course, having to then follow up, we see this so many times, then time and time again. But again, not having any legal mechanism on the book. There's nothing legally binding sometimes around community benefit agreements and things like that.
Yeah, which is why every rezoning should have an oversight task force, the way that Gowanus has, which is actually funded. I would say ours is not funded. We are privately fundraising for facilitation, and that is not a sustainable model, and many communities cannot do that. So this really needs to be thought about in every future rezoning.
And I will say, there's ways to legislate to a solution and have MOUs and, put on record, but a lot of this is also can be mitigated through good process. And if the city can, look at how to strengthen the city agencies and give them what they need to help streamline and communicate and coordinate and deliver, kind of not just with rezonings, but especially with rezonings when we know there's going to be a lot of development. We don't need a bill in city council or extra funding line for that. We need supportive, good process and good communication across our city agencies so that people, and ability to have them staffed properly and adequately so people aren't running on fumes. And I think that can go a long way too.
A question I was kind of just thinking in general around scalability, right? How do we scale these to a citywide scale where we know that, so it's fascinating how many different models we have, right? The Conservancy model where, Central Park gets a lot of money from private residents that live on the park, that wealthy benefactors. You have Brooklyn Bridge Park, which has properties on the park that pay a rent basically that goes to maintenance. You have privately developed land like Domino Park. You have models like the High Line similarly have these different mechanisms. Some get to hold on to concessions, some don't. What of those kind of models and other ones that you hear, it could be here in the city or elsewhere, that you think that you would love to see in the city, or think they could be scalable? I'm thinking a little bit about the stormwater fee. I know we've talked a bunch about that. Different ways that are not just development-based that you think could be scalable in New York.
I could talk about the stormwater fee. I think that's huge. And I think that, I think the unified stormwater rule that just passed is covering, making sure that new development is installing green infrastructure. I think the stormwater fee, which it does feel like there's good legislation at the state level that's going to help enable, would incentivize private property owners to build green infrastructure. I feel like I think that incentives for existing buildings are something that the city has never really experimented with, and is something that we really should look at, because we can't just develop our way out of this. There's so much existing infrastructure in the city that we really need to address, and people aren't going to do it by themselves.
Anyone else?
Well, I don't want to pivot this to an adaptive reuse conversation, but I 100% agree with that and think we need to figure out ways for new to not be the solution. And then, just referencing the work you've done at CUF, I think a lot of the ideas are scalable for, can we have citywide systems that feed into a bigger pot for public realm?
Okay, thinking about this in a way that, knowing we are in election season, if you were talking to the next mayor, whoever that might be, and thinking of ways that they could get some sort of funding for the public realm, what would that conversation be? What would you tell them to do? This is an imaginary future mayor who we do not know will be.
Speaking for myself and not for my company, I think this is circular, and rising tides raise all ships, and a quality public realm improves the health of our communities and how we feel about the day and how we feel about others. And so by starting with that as a baseline and fundamental thing, as a sort of the health of the city, it'll improve all the other aspects of the way the city conducts business.
I would echo that, and then also encourage building in redundancy. I think to your point, we're in a moment where funding's being pulled, we're not sure of what existing systems will remain or will be supported, and so I think redundancy is more important than ever, and planning now for that is critical.
What about you, Andrea? In the room alone with the next mayor.
I mean, I do think just like making the case that this is important. I don't feel like we've ever had a mayor that really takes climate change seriously. And I feel like that's what we need to start having, those conversations, that like if we don't actually plant more trees, the city's going to become unlivable. If we don't care for those trees, if we don't make more parks, if we don't start managing stormwater, we are not going to thrive here. And I don't feel like that conversation has really happened. It's happened like in these kinds of rooms, but no mayor has had that as their manifesto.
And something that I think, Rebecca, I know Municipal Art Society did a lot of this work, the Alliance for Public Space Leadership that we're both members on did a lot of this work. The appointment of Yating Liu as the public realm, a person whose job it is to be the czar of the public realm, because it touches so many different agencies. I'm thinking a little bit about like, what have you seen from these last 4 years of this administration that makes you hopeful for the next 4 years? Things like good things that we want to see keep going, that are promising. Because I know we were involved in a lot of that work with Yating's appointment.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, caveat, I give my colleagues at MAS credit. I was still at Design Commission at City Hall when the advocacy for her appointment was happening. I think she's done incredible work with the resources she's been given, and having that name recognition of Director of Public Realm certainly is an important step. That said, one person can only do so much, especially when one person is banked under a deputy mayor with reporting lines that don't necessarily solve the coordination and communication across capital agencies that are working in public realm. So I think, building upon the precedent of having either a person or an office or just general importance to coordination around public realm, I'd love to see the next administration sort of build on that and either resource up a position like horrors, or think about how it can be an ethos in City Hall and it doesn't have to be a single czar, because that's a really heavy burden for one person to bear, and it's a really big uphill battle if the coordination across capital agencies isn't sort of solved for in conjunction with that role.
And it feels like it needs to be baked into each agency's mission in a way that it hasn't been. Like that, just having one person that's outside the agencies isn't going to solve the problem.
Yeah. Mike, any signs of progress these last 4 years that you're hoping to see go forward, or things that have been really kind of, that have taken you or inspired you in New York these last couple of years?
Well, it's been really amazing in our little corner of the world at Domino to see how much folks sort of value the public open space there. And, going back to the sort of skepticism of us as developers and what we're trying to do as developers building a park and public space, it feels good to sort of see folks come to the park and know that we sort of did our end, we held up our end of the bargain when it comes to the public space. And I think it's important for the next administration and these other developments going forward for that also to be the case.
Thinking about, and also just seeing these really inspiring models, a lot of which are coming from private park operators that are really taking the ball. I've been personally saying that bids have been really inspiring the last couple of years, doing some of the most interesting public realm work. I said a lot of meat packing, where they're doing such cool work there, and went to the Harlem Mere up in Central Park recently, which just opened, which is an amazing capital project. And it's a lot of the private partners that are doing a lot of that work. A question I wanted to ask, I know we have some questions from the crowd coming soon. How do we ensure that when we make these green infrastructure investments, parks, stormwater maintenance, all these things, street trees, how do we ensure that we don't create disparities in access and quality? And of course, we know the word green gentrification. How do we not accelerate these patterns that we've seen happen and ripple throughout the city? What can we do as advocates, but also as what could the city do?
I think actually just getting here today and walking into this neighborhood makes me a little, I think a little fearful about what is coming for Gowanus, and I think folks who have been in the neighborhood for a while probably really feel that. I think that there's a way of managing the public realm that doesn't feel exclusive, but that needs to be set up before the exclusivity moves in. And I think that's really what we're trying to do in Gowanus is before, like all the buildings are going up like crazy. People just started moving in. We're starting to see a lot more people in the neighborhood and we're starting to feel the change. So everyone who has been in Gowanus is trying to just like buckle down and get our governance together so that we can really have a model that makes sure that we all are protected and supported into the future. So I think when we're thinking about the bid, it really is a form of local governance. We're talking to a lot of small business owners on 3rd Avenue that are like, I'm going to get priced out of here. How does the bid actually bake into its services supporting and preserving local arts and culture? And that's, I feel like, something that we're able to do at this point in development that I think is harder to do once the development has happened.
Yes and yes. But I also think there's a place to make quality public realm and public open space a baseline, not an amenity. And if we can do that, which, not to go back to the harp on comprehensive planning, but we could achieve that through some comprehensive planning. But if it becomes a baseline, not an amenity, then I think you've solved for that. And I think if we, not just public realm and open space, but all of the elements of community infrastructure, if we can change the way we talk about these things, the way we have expectations from ourselves and community and city to deliver these spaces, then they're not, the special anymore.
Mike, anything you want to add? I'm curious a bit about the trade-offs, knowing about right now this very specific financial situation we're in where so much federal funding was coming to parks and open spaces. I'm kind of getting weary about the big federal grant that was going to pay for Queensway in Queens where I live. And the future of that. What do you do now when that goes away? What do you do when individual giving goes away? The kind of unpredictability and uncertainty of this moment, which feels, I think, for our parks and open spaces, quite precarious. What do you think the trade-offs are between public and private funding when it comes to maintaining high-quality open spaces? How to plan around those different funding sources?
In the case of Domino Park, which is completely privately funded, I'm also a community member. I live on South 3rd and Kent Avenue, so Domino Park is also my park in addition to living there. But none of my tax dollars go to pay for Domino Park because it's privately financed from the development. But as a community member, there's a bit of trust that goes into the operators of Domino Park to make sure that they're doing right by the community. And, like I said, we like to hold up our end of the bargain, so we did it the right way. But I could understand how there'd be skepticism for other developers or other communities with a developer coming in with a similar promise.
I think also to that point that the original model, I mentioned Central Park. I also worked there for some time, so I have much respect for the Conservancy folks and still chat with those folks to this day. The original model was we're going to take this weight off the city's back, especially during the fiscal crisis. The Conservancy model really started during then. And I think a lot of parks advocates have always felt like the city didn't meet up its side of the bargain, right? The city kind of at that moment was like, please take Bryant Park, take Central Park, please take care for them. And they do such an amazing job doing that. But feeling like they didn't meet their side of the bargain, that the city never came back and was like, wow, we have all this funding for parks now. And seeing those numbers dwindle and dwindle and dwindle. And I think that's something that relying on these different sources has felt like it's taken political pressure off the city almost to act in a way.
Yeah, and this is sort of a tangent, but the other thing I'll harp other than comp planning, I think to enable there to be less of a lag is procurement reform, because I think one of the biggest differences we see is that in public-private partnerships and some of these conservancies, they're able to procure in different ways, both teams and goods, which allows things to move faster and more affordably. And especially in the face of the tariffs and cost escalation and unknown funding, I think having the city look at how we procure both teams and things to help be more competitive so that it can fill the gap of where there's not public-private partnership or conservancy is really important.
Yeah. And also I'll just mention that last call, just to submit questions if you want from the audience so we can get to them towards the end. Yeah, to that point, I mean, like, we're going to need these alternate delivery mechanisms, right? If the city's dollars kind of shrivel up or we have less to go around. I think about this a lot with libraries. When the library systems get to deliver a project, they actually deliver them typically way faster and cheaper than the city does. And thinking about ways that we might have to lean on those models a little bit more. The kind of last question I have before I'll take the audience questions was just, how do we reconcile the need for minimal management with the expectations for highly curated urban green spaces in neighborhoods like North Brooklyn? Like, we have some parks here that don't have to be so programmed, right? How do we kind of maintain the plazas and things like that, but also keep these more curated green spaces, especially along the waterfront, the balance of all these different kind of spaces?
I'll take that one. So I have a mantra at our office in Domino Park, and that's don't try so hard. And Domino Park is a highly programmed, highly designed space. It's highly managed. But our most successful activities and programs in the park have been initiated by the community who have just sort of come to the park and started doing those things. And so I always encourage us to say yes to the folks who want to do something in the park, whether it's our salsa series that started as a few folks sort of dancing salsa and has grown into 800 people a week dancing salsa every September. Or we recently saw that there's some folks started using longevity sticks. It's this sort of like exercise that involves a broomstick-looking thing, doing some sort of exercise together. And in other sort of highly managed spaces, they'd probably immediately be told that they needed a permit and they had to leave. And I've sort of instructed our staff to encourage and grow those types of things because that's how you really sort of create a sense of community in a place.
I love that idea. Like, you don't have to try so hard. People, like, that kind of like famous thing where they put lawn chairs down in Times Square during the Bloomberg years. People just start sitting in these lawn chairs in Times Square. I always think about that story. So we have some great questions from the audience. And I want to get to a lot of them because they touch on a lot of different topics. The first one, this one kind of just popped up for me. What is the version of congestion pricing for parks and open spaces? That's a great question. Great question. Well put, too.
Well, I'd like to give credit to Center for Urban Future report. I think ticket surcharges, huge. But also, can we charge for trash and have parking fees? Why do we give parking for free on our streets? And maybe a fee for that would both incentivize people to not drive, and also then if you pay for parking or have a permit fee, it'll go to the public realm. And trash, rather than yes, mandate composting, but also in other places there's, a charge. If you have an overflow of trash, you're charged for that, and that can go back to public realm too.
Yeah. What else? Congestion.
I do think the stormwater fee is another one. If you have impermeable space, you should pay for green infrastructure.
What about you, Mike? Congestion pricing right next to the Williamsburg Bridge.
Well, we want to encourage as many people to come to the park as possible. But yeah, so it'd be interesting if there was some sort of community-driven process that encouraged people to come to parks, or they got some stars or bonus points or something for the number of times you go to a park with your family or something.
Yeah, it's something that I think also this idea that there's going to be specific stormwater fee being so much more applicable in a place that deals with a lot of flooding, right? Thinking about this a lot with Flushing Meadows, we're like, yeah, I mentioned that there's not really wealthy benefactors around Flushing and Corona, but the U.S. Open happens in Flushing Meadows, Governor's Ball happens in Flushing Meadows, the Mets happen in Flushing Meadows. There's all these things that we generate in parks, right, that often don't go back. And can we think of different ways to tap into those things? I think it's certainly an interesting conversation.
And to piggyback on that, with my RAIN Coalition hat on, most of the green infrastructure assets that we have in the city are in park-starved neighborhoods. They are not currently being adequately maintained. If DEP was able to have a stormwater fee and direct that money to care for those green infrastructure assets that would provide jobs and greening to neighborhoods that really need them.
Andrea, this is an interesting question for you, especially as you're kind of thinking about the bid model. How do you get existing smaller businesses, not massive developers, to buy into the idea of effectively taxing themselves by joining a bid?
It's interesting that actually I feel like the small commercial tenants have been the easiest people to get on board because they have seen other bids work. I think the Fifth Avenue bid in Park Slope is an extremely successful bid that really helps small businesses. And small businesses really see that and are quite honestly just like quite scared about all of this new development coming in and see this as a way for them to have a voice in the changing neighborhood. In Gowanus, I think in particular, the kind of public realm services that we're talking about, street tree management to make sure that there's actually a canopy so that the sidewalk isn't so hot so customers can get to you, flood resiliency so that your store doesn't flood, so that your basement doesn't flood, and just supporting arts and culture. Those are all things that I think small business owners have been asking the city to do for years and are really, really excited about having this capacity to work on.
Another question that came up that's kind of interesting because we've touched on a little bit about capital and expense funding specifically. It's a question that right now is really driving the One LIC project, which for folks that don't know, it's the Annabelle Basin where Amazon HQ2 is supposed to be, is going up for this huge rezoning. And they're really thinking about this specific question, which is, should there be a formula for how much capital and expense funding is provided per rezoning based on the amount of housing that it's bringing to the public realm? I think it's a great question.
Perhaps. I'm about to put my foot in it because I think I'm fuzzy on the details. But if memory serves, I think the de Blasio administration had a pot, I forget of how much money, that would give infrastructure investment in, to help serve in rezoning areas. And to my knowledge, this administration, I think it was named like a seed fund, but I'm not sure how much money and where that money's gone. And so I think revisiting that model could definitely be useful moving forward.
I think it needs to have to do more with what the needs are, and that goes back to the comprehensive planning comment, is that like in a neighborhood that needs a lot of infrastructure in order, like the city should commit to the infrastructure that is required to support the new housing.
And this was a huge issue in Long Island City where we brought all these housing before we built the schools, before we built the water mains, before we built transportation, which I know was a question that someone asked. That like the housing almost like preceded all the infrastructure and led to a ton of problems, right?
And on that, though, we need to talk about public open spaces infrastructure in the same way that we're talking about the schools and the sewers. And I think someone at DEP was telling me recently, it's tricky because you can't oversize the sewer, like you need to have that timing right, but there's no downside to build a park in advance of people coming, right? There's not that same tricky timing issue.
It's interesting too, and I think a lot of this just like parks as an afterthought seems to be this theme that keeps coming up. Parks and open spaces as an afterthought where actually, interestingly, libraries during rezoning, the library system usually gets an upgrade or the library gets upgraded or there's money put towards a capital plan. I know this happened in Inwood. But you don't really see the same for parks and open spaces. Sometimes they're promised, but it's not usually in the main kind of conversation. I think there's so much there around like, it is this afterthought or something that isn't really at top of mind amongst administrations or planners per se.
I mean, I think they're planned for in a lot of ways. I give credit to city planning. I think, in their neighborhood studies and plans, there's areas identified for open space and also through POPs programs, thinking of incentives. But being planned for and being delivered is, as we've talked about, are two different things.
Sure. Andrea, there's a couple Gowanus questions. What have you seen as, and I hope you're able to answer this, what have been failures so far in Gowanus caused by inadequate funding? Or just failures in general. Let's just go with failures, but this one specifically caused by inadequate funding.
It is, I would say, in a little bit. I think that a failure of the Gowanus Waterfront Access Plan that Long Island City should look at is that the incentives for public bathrooms were not strong enough. Public bathrooms need to be required. Basically, there's 10 private development sites along the Gowanus Canal. There's a very strong incentive that one of them should have taken. Not a single one has taken it. And that's really critical infrastructure that we're going to end up picking up human feces for many, many years because of that oversight. But I would say that it does have to do with funding, because I think if there was a stable funding mechanism and maintenance partner to make sure that those bathrooms were maintained, one of the owners might have done it, which is why, ideally, we should have fought to get the bid written into the rezoning in some way. It didn't seem possible at the time, but that would have, I think, promoted better public space design. And I would just say boat launches is the other incentive that is not getting used at all.
I would say to that point, there's opportunity for POPs to have bathrooms mandated too. Just thinking about our bathroom infrastructure throughout the entire city.
Hot topic right now.
And yeah.
I will say that operating a public restroom is maybe the most complicated thing that anybody could do in the city of New York.
Yeah, when I just did this recent work around concessions, I spoke with a lot of concessionaires, and they're like, we don't even bid on certain park projects because one person said they're not in the toilet paper business, which I thought was amazing to say. But it's a lot of work, and also it comes with also all these other issues, right? People that are mentally ill, or people that have a lot of health issues. You have to deal with that. That's kind of on your plate. And I think a lot of people are scared of dealing with that, or it's a lot of money and a lot more work than you think, right? And this lack of a maintenance partner really freaks out the city. I see this so much with public space projects getting hindered. Why don't we?
Do you regret your public bathroom?
No, and we strive
great
to have
bathroom.
the nicest public restroom in all of New York City, but it is a horrible business to be in.
I would say if there were more of them, it wouldn't be as horrible of a business because it wouldn't be crowd rushed, right?
Right.
I was thinking about this, the bathroom in Tompkins Square Park, which is a park I used to live near, finally reopened after I don't even know, gazillion-dollar renovation. It looks amazing, and I'm just like, how long is this gonna last, this bathroom? Because we have no maintenance for it, right? It's beautiful, we did this great thing, but it's no Bryant Park where there's music playing in the bathroom and they have this incredible budget to be able to maintain that. This is a great question. As I mentioned before, a lot of other cities are figuring this out. They're putting in revenue streams, they're thinking of doing this, and New York has fallen behind in that way. Why don't you think an alternate dedicated revenue stream for parks has received strong public support? Why do you think, what is lacking here in New York that we can't seem to get behind this robust public realm plan in this city? We're a city very much defined by our public realm, I would say, obviously.
I think we take it for granted and we don't talk about it correctly. I think both public at large and folks in the professional sphere working around it, we haven't figured out how to communicate how important it is to a livable city. And I think we can talk about housing in that way and transit in that way. And something about the way we're talking about public realm hasn't clicked, and it's something we all just take so for granted.
And maybe also the success of the Central Park Conservancy. I feel like that weighs over us in the conservancy world constantly.
How's
It's
that?
oh, well, couldn't you just fundraise for this? Just because they are able to raise so much money and do such a good job of public space maintenance, it makes it seem easy.
Well, yeah, this is something that comes up a lot, and folks are aware there, where the conservancy model kind of promised this level of quality, and if you can't meet it, it's okay. But also a lot of policymakers that are just parks are good. They have all this money. Why would I need to fund it? Or they seem to be good based on what I see, but it's in only specific neighborhoods they're good. So there's a political pressure there.
Or you fund the delivery, right? Because the ribbon cutting is great, and to deliver a park and then to maintain it gets a little rockier.
Yeah. So there's a question here about transportation, which I think is kind of adjacent to this, but we've touched on it just a little bit. Rezoning's obviously changed the zoning and land use of a neighborhood, but they also dramatically changed the transportation, both people and freight needs of an area. How can the city and developers better plan for and accommodate these changes? In terms of, I know it's a little bit adjacent to parks, but I do think, thinking of our greenways, it definitely has a huge kind of connection to parks.
Comprehensive planning?
Yeah, and also looking at new transportation options that are a bit more flexible than the sort of complexity and expense of a new subway line. You know, the ferry along the North Brooklyn waterfront is a great example of something that could be implemented more quickly, and I don't want to say numbers, but probably cheaper than a subway system.
Yeah, because I took the ferry to commute here, and is that scalable? How do we get that to be scalable, right? It's not making money. People aren't using it to commute. I chose to wait in line for 20 minutes rather than hop on the subway and pay twice as much. Like, how can we get that to be a viable option? I don't know.
I like this idea, though, of parks being able to show other modes, right? Like you have this with bikeways already, thinking of a dockless program. City Bike is already doing this a lot. A waterfront greenway is going through so many parks. What do you see about that in Gowanus with transportation? I know Gowanus has always had transportation challenges.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the biggest challenge right now is that MTA didn't really give us anything for the rezoning. So we're not, I mean, we are very well connected by transit, but our subway platforms are going to get very, very crowded. They already are crowded, and the entrances need a lot of work. There's no elevators. I feel like getting MTA more under city control is a really interesting, that I don't understand MTA enough to really speak very well on this, but that seems like a really interesting way to go.
That's interesting that the MTA not being involved with rezonings that much at all. It's usually a city-led process, right? Even though we were just talking about this earlier, they hold this gigantic portfolio. They're obviously key infrastructure. This has happened in my own backyard with Innovation Queens, which is this huge project that's kind of stretching into Astoria, where there's this one subway station that not a lot of people use. It's quite quiet right now, but it's exactly where Innovation Queens is going to be, and I think that was part of the developer's idea. But right now, it's a pretty small station. It's going to get crammed. I mean, we saw this with Bedford Avenue, right? Like a station that was not built for the sheer number of people it sees, and how you get the MTA and these other agencies to get involved with transportation and think about this with rezonings. A question that also came up, similar to another question about Gowanus bid. What do you think that's going to be able to afford you in Gowanus that you wouldn't be able to have otherwise by creating a bid? What will you be able to get from that?
Management of the actual public realm outside of the newly created privately owned public spaces. Like the newly created privately owned public spaces will be fine. It is to the developer's interest. Like here they got turned over to parks, which was a mistake. In Gowanus, they're not getting turned over to parks. The developers would probably care for them at a fairly good level. I think we'll do the better as the bid, but they would do it. But really the funding for actual management of the 10 acres of new publicly owned public space, that would not happen. And then management of the street trees. We're getting over 500 new street trees planted in Gowanus over the next 5 years. Most, I don't know the mortality rate, but I think we all know that street trees die, generally, unless they're cared for. And we need to make sure that doesn't happen. We need to make sure they actually thrive and create the canopy that we need. Otherwise, we're going to see islands of beautiful green space next to new high-rises, and then the existing neighborhood, parts of the existing neighborhood, specifically existing public housing, not having any of that green infrastructure at all.
When you were having those conversations with the city, because I've taken tours with the Conservancy and seen the rain garden work that you do in the street trees, what was that conversation like? That we're like, we're going to put these in and we hope someone takes care of them, or we hope a group like you takes care of them. What were those conversations like with the city?
I mean, I think, I feel like the city has created a lot of really great policies that are all about are all about capital, right? Yeah. So the city is not planting the trees, the developers are. The developers are required to plant new street trees, but they're not required to maintain them, and the city's not really required to maintain them. I would say that every time we talk to an agency about something we want in Gowanus, they say, well, who is the maintenance partner going to be? How are we actually going to make sure that works? And that's really again, how we, from looking at neighborhoods across the city, which neighborhoods actually have successful street tree management, who actually has capacity to manage public spaces besides Central Park Conservancy, and it's bids. Yeah. That is actually a sustainable an equitable source of funding for a neighborhood. It's not everyone is putting in and everyone has a say in how that funding is spent annually, and I think that's a really different model. It's very helpful.
And it's something that, other than that, it's basically volunteers that are taking care of it, right? For street trees, where it's, you get 2 years where the contractor takes care of it, but after that, it's either a bid that takes it up, a park group, or volunteers that take it up. Otherwise, the city kind of backs off.
Exactly.
Yeah, because I feel like a lot of the conversations that we've been having is around maintenance, not so much, I mean, we can obviously have money to build new parks, new open spaces, but maintaining them, the maintenance, is the tricky. It seems way trickier than capital.
It's all about maintenance. I mean, I would say, like, in Gowanus, we're getting 2 massive new sewage tanks. They're both going to have parks on top of them. DEP is building public space because they know a bid is going to be able to take care of it. They would not be doing it otherwise. And that's, I mean, there's so many agencies that own land that could be doing great things with it. It doesn't all need to be in the Parks Department. But we need to have these partnerships in order to make it work.
Yeah, go ahead, Rebecca.
I was just saying, going back to that point of not all in the Parks Department and the point of like Yating's position and just general public realm leadership in City Hall, we need to figure out how it's not like, accountability soup and pointing fingers at which agency is doing what, right? We need to figure out a way that the city can care for its public realm, regardless of if it's Department of Sanitation, DEP, Parks, and how can each agency be, tooled to do it in a streamlined way, not like reinventing the wheel across capital agencies.
I was thinking about specifically hearing DEP also create public space is exciting, though. I mean, it's a agency that I don't think saw itself in the public realm very much, that the MTA didn't see itself in the public realm, is now starting to a little bit more, where I work right next to the NoHo-Soho rezoning, which was the most tenuous rezoning, I think, under the de Blasio administration in many ways. But there was this really cool partnership between DEP and Parks to turn all their gravel water testing sites into these little parklets that are like really beautiful. But they only did that because the Village Alliance, the local bid, takes care of it. And it's a beautiful little parklet. So needing a bid to be able to do this work where, you kind of have to like put the cart before the horse a little bit, the chicken and the egg situation. Okay, we're coming to the end of our time. I would love to just think about, one more question. Great. We're in a bit of saying it very, very lightly, we're in a bit of an uncertain time in New York City, especially at the political leadership. I think folks in the parks world saw that the commissioner's leaving us at the end of this month, earlier this week. Unclear what City Hall is going to look like next year, but thinking specifically around building support for the public realm, for whoever might be the next mayor. What's kind of your thoughts going into this next 6 months as practitioners, and also way to continue to build support for these kind of conversations around public-private partnerships, around bids, around these different models? What are you thinking about going into these next couple of months?
I'll say that I think we have to be continue to be committed to doing the work. So political administrations are going to change. There's going to be different people at the Parks Department or at these other city agencies. But as the public space managers who are continuing to operate these spaces, we're committed to a much longer term vision than just the 6 months, and it's important to stay committed to that. And
those projects span administration so often, right? What about you, Rebecca or Andrea?
Yeah, I would say, this current administration is undertaking, I don't know if unprecedented, but a huge number of rezonings right now. And so the next administration is definitely going to pick up the baton about how to sort of dot the I's and cross the T's, and how to actually have those rezonings be, support for neighborhood and communities. So at MIS, we've been thinking a lot of like, how can we, starting 2026, work with the city to kind of pass the baton on the rezonings and help the folks in city agencies continue to see that work through, to your point, continuity. I also think tying, maybe back to an earlier question of like, how do we get public space to be part of the conversation? Housing is part of everyone's platform, and if we can start to tie housing in conversation to public space, I think that would be a good strategy. Like London has minimum open space requirements per dwelling unit. We're not going to get there for a variety of reasons, but what if we started to think about it in the same way?
What about you, Andrea? Thinking about these next couple of months.
Yeah, I think that, I definitely have been thinking about how can we focus locally as much as possible and really build our local collaboration, understand who's getting impacted in what way, how we can share resources, how we can, double up in ways. I think it's such a scary moment, but it doesn't have to be. We have so many resources in the city, even without the federal government, and I think that if we can collaborate and trust each other, that would go a long way to just addressing some of the larger challenges in the world. I feel like talking to all of my partner organizations around the city as well as in the neighborhood, I think there is this, in this time of crisis, there's also this time of connection and conversation that I think people are open to, and I want to lean into that.
I think that's a great message. Continue to do the work. To end on, can I get a round of applause for this great panel? Thank you so much. Katie, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, audience, and all of our moderators for such a thoughtful, wide-ranging day of conversations. I also loved all of the conversations around the bid toward the end. It kind of went full circle in the beginning of the remarks. If you were here, Lincoln had discussed our own bid efforts here in the North Side. Probably most people in the room don't know that yesterday was bid day, so happy bid day. But I wasn't planning on doing this, but because it came up so much in conversation today, our efforts were funded yesterday in SBS's announcements. So we did receive a $100,000 grant to move forward from SBS with our bid formation here in the North Side, which is getting closer to a reality, so we can start maintaining our spaces in a more significant way. So thank you. Through it all, the North Brooklyn waterfront has remained a space of transformation, not just of land, but as we heard today, of ideas. Ideas about how we can live together better, how we can share spaces, how we plan for the future, how we can collaborate, to Andrea's point. And the challenges ahead are real. The commitment to everyone in this room is also real, and so we welcome that. Thank you for being part of today, and thank you for being part of the next chapter. Enjoy the rest of your Wednesday, everyone.